intensity of the moment. Kolek airs it out, looking for Kerrigan. Body to body, Kerrigan's got it!
Bertstack, Blake, trying to throw it wide open, Max Castle, and the DC Breeze hold on the New York Empire.
Yacht looking to the end zone. He's got Babbitt on the far side, double coverage. Babbitt got it! New York wins it at the buzzer!
Garvey throws it up easy. Williams, an anticlimactic end to the game for one more to go. Here it goes. This is for the game. Up into the end zone. Who's going to get there? It's caught! Jack Williams takes it down!
Jack Williams with 3. Williams goes across the field. It's a jump ball to decide the game. And it comes down to the hands of Ben Yacht, who catches the winner on his 30th birthday to send New York to the Final Four.
This is always a treat to come to DC when they come to us. What a rivalry we have. The number of overtime, double overtime, 1-point games we play them is unreal. It's always tense, it's always high level, and I absolutely love it.
Welcome back. Divisional Championship weekend here on Swing Pass. We are at the end of the road of the 2023 AUDL season. Just 8 teams remain, all still vying for championship weekend spots, which will be held on August 25th and 26th in Eagan, Minnesota. I am Adam Ruffner. That is Daniel Cohen. Daniel, we couldn't be more excited to be here. We've got 7 games remaining on the slate. We took a little bit of a breather with a bye weekend last weekend between the opening round of the playoffs, now divisional championship weekend. But it really feels like the momentum is still carrying forward. These truly seem to be the 8 best teams remaining in the league. They all deserve to be here for one reason or another. What are just some of your opening thoughts heading into these 4 games this weekend, which will then lead into the 3 championship games in just a few weeks?
I just love that New York is the only team of this group that was at championship weekend last year. We're going to have a brand new South Division champion. LA hasn't made it since 2018. Salt Lake obviously has never made it before. Minnesota's never made it before. Indy hasn't made it since 2019. So we're going to get a lot of fresh new blood at championship weekend, which just makes this weekend all the more interesting, setting the table.
You're right. I mean, New York, obviously the reigning champs, 27-game winning streak intact. They are the presumptive favorites as they've been since the beginning of last season, it feels like. I don't think they've been displaced from the top of my power rankings since some time in 2021 when Carolina won the championship. So it's been quite a run as the Empire sit on the verge of clinching really the first dynastic performance in this league's history, seeking their 2nd straight title, their 3rd in 4 years. But like you say, aside from that, a whole lot of newcomers with a lot of stuff to prove. I think we'll start off with the first game of the weekend. Speaking of 2 teams looking to prove something, Austin and Atlanta getting it on for the South Division title game. These 2 franchises will be in position to possibly get their first championship weekend appearance. It's been all Carolina and Dallas since that division was founded in 2015. Atlanta has won the only matchup this season between the 2 franchises. Way back in week 3, Atlanta claimed a 21-17 win at home over the Soul, but the Soul seemingly have gone through multiple transitions this year. You know, we went into the season expecting them to be one of the more highly powered offensive attacks in the AUDL. That still holds true as far as highlights go and some amazing plays. You know, Kyle Henke, Evan Swiatek, Mark Evans. These guys are going to make big plays. But the offensive efficiency hasn't always been there for the Soul, and it's been the Austin D-line leading the league in break rate conversion this year. They have really carried this team's momentum to 10 wins and on the verge of their first championship weekend appearance. And on the other side, Atlanta has a top 5 offense and defense and the lowest opponent break rate given up on offense. So the league's best break rate team on defense in Austin versus the league's best in not allowing breaks on offense in Atlanta, going toe-to-toe in the South Division Championship game. What are you looking forward to in this matchup?
Well, first, I just want to reference last year's game late in the season between Austin and Atlanta. I know it wasn't technically a playoff game, but that was like essentially to decide that second playoff spot in the South, right? So I just love kind of like the added storyline you get here, because based on like how Austin won that game last year, was it a 4-goal deficit in the fourth quarter that they somehow overcame? I mean, that was...
Atlanta had played an overtime game against Dallas the night before, and we're definitely feeling that Texas heat in the second half in Austin. And I believe it was week 11 of the regular season in 2022.
It was late. But that was like such a wild finish. And I feel like this, I mean, they just had the one regular season game this year, and it was like a pretty close game for most of it before Atlanta pulled away in the last quarter. But I just think there is like kind of a different level to playoff ultimate. Like we saw with Austin 2 weeks ago against Carolina, they rose to the occasion. We haven't seen, obviously, either of these teams win the South Division. And like you mentioned, just one playoff win for both these franchises in their histories. So it's going to be super interesting just to see like which team can kind of tighten up and play their best ultimate when it counts most in the season.
It does feel like Austin is starting to play its best ultimate. Obviously, that big win against Carolina just under 2 weeks ago really clinched that, but they have just 30 turnovers in their past 2 games. It feels like the offense is starting to get a little bit more into rhythm. I know they converted on just 47% of their offensive possessions in Carolina in that opening round of the playoffs, but their hold percentage was good. This is an Austin offense that plays good defense off of turns. Kyle Henke, Evan Swiatek, all those guys can get after it in transition, earn the disc back, and possibly convert some dirty holds for the Austin O-line. And on the flip side, you've got this Atlanta team that's just peaking, right? Like this hustle team feels like a true championship contender to me. I feel like they've been a little undersold so far going into this postseason. We've had our eye kind of on New York. Obviously, Salt Lake has looked super impressive with their league-leading scoring and offensive efficiency in 2023. But this hustle team, they're just solid top to bottom. I mean, you talk about Halsmeyer, Burnett, Draco, Bobby Lay, Christian Olsen is once again just a rock with the disc. They add Liam Haberfield this year, who stands to be one of the best rookies in the league in 2023, even though obviously he's in his prime, comes over from Australia, has a bit more experience than a traditional rookie. But I mean, he's got that flick throw from God, right? And he looks like Thor and can just run around out there and make plays. They've just got depth playmakers everywhere on both lines. And yet this feels like kind of a toss-up game. I think Atlanta obviously plays amazingly at home. They've, I think, been under 12 turnovers a game this season playing at Silverback Stadium. They just possess the disc as well as anybody in the AUDL the past several seasons. And yet, because of how Austin looked in their win against Carolina, they just have that spark, right? And we've wondered about this Soul team, about when they can kind of flick the switch and engage some of this talent. And they did that by putting down a Flyers team who has historically held them a little bit under. You know, Carolina advanced to championship weekend in 2022 by putting down the Soul. Feels like a little bit of getting the monkey off their back. It feels like a continuation of the momentum that they built on in 2022 when they qualified for the playoffs for the first time in a few years. This Austin team, I think, still has something to prove. And as Kyle Henke even said to Evan Lepler, they feel like they're playing with house money. They feel like they have little to lose at this point. And I feel like that's a perfect mindset for the Soul going into this divisional championship team against a very tough competitor in the hustle.
No, definitely. I'm really excited to see if the Soul D-line can replicate that efficiency we saw against Carolina and what they've shown most of the season. You have to remember, most of their season was played against the lower teams of the division, Dallas and Houston. So it's hard to read into their stats so much, but they were 5 of 8 on break chances in that first game against Atlanta. I really think that could be the difference maker, because we haven't seen a game from them offensively where they're converting more than 60%. So if they're going to be hovering in the 50s O-line conversion wise, they kind of have to be overly efficient defensively to make up for that, playing against a team like Atlanta. But, when Atlanta rolls out Halsmeyer, Dean Ramsey, Jeremy Langdon, Hayden Austin-Knabb is active for this game. He might play some offense. These are very solid two-way players that if they do turn the disc over Atlanta's very good at getting it back and converting that dirty hold anyway. So to me, that's kind of the offense defense matchup to watch, is with the Austin Soul D-line offense.
I mean, but the Soul defense can rack up those breaks. Again, they have the league leading break rate, 23. They're 17 of 22 in the past 2 games alone. They were 8 of 9 or 7 of 8 against Carolina.
7 of 8, I think.
They continue to pour it on when they need to. That attack led by Joey Wiley, Matt Armar, and the rest of that like transition-oriented Soul defense, get up and go mentality has just served them so well. And it feels like they sort of set up a bit of a pitfall beneath opposing O-lines in the way that they get out and they run so quickly. There's zero hesitation in kind of their pick up and go strategy following opponents' turns. And I wonder if Atlanta has that composure. It feels like, to your point, that they absolutely do. I mean, you talk about the weapons that they have if they do turn the disc over. Brett Halsmeyer led the league in blocks 2 seasons ago and is a league leader again this year. Christian Olsen is another name that continues to come up. He's platooned on defense throughout his career, can match up amazingly. Austin Taylor also, I think, is dangerous in how he can lay out for the disc in transition, get it back for that hustle O-line. To your point, I'm interested to see which point kind of gives. If it's Austin not being allowed to initiate that quick attack transition counter, or if Atlanta can really kind of hold the line even as Soul defenders just throw themselves again and again. This is one of the more athletic and fast defensive units in the league, and that's, I think, what really spring loads their counterattack.
Definitely. I'm also wondering, I'm just looking at the numbers right now. Austin's converted 48% of their O-line conversions this season, and they're up over 56% on D-line. That's an 8 percentage point margin that their D-line has been better at punching in scores than their O-line. Like, what do you do with that if you're Austin coming into this game? I mean, we saw Joey Wiley crossing over the O-line late in that Carolina game, and he was on fire. Like, they do have some really talented offensive players playing defense. They'll cross Matt Armor over to offense too. Like, do you think that they should maybe be more willing to take that approach, like early in this game, and kind of like load up their O-line with some of those defensive playmakers? Or do you feel like it's time to just kind of trust what the O-line's been building and hope they can put it together in the most important game of the season for them?
I think it's got to be the latter. I don't think you can just hit the panic button midway through the first quarter, especially against a team as talented as Atlanta. I really feel like they will take advantage of those lack of reps, even as you're kind of like trying to puzzle piece fit in a solution and a Joey Wiley. I think at the end of the game, if it comes down to it, absolutely they use him similarly as they did in the opening round matchup against the Flyers. But yeah, I think you got to kind of stay in the groove, right? Like, you can't really reveal that you're getting anxious against this Atlanta team. I think that's where they feel comfortable teeing off against you. They'll start setting in their zone, making you throw a little bit more, trying some of those offside layout block attempts from a Burnett, a JP Burns, a Bradley Sunjins. They've just got so many playmakers on this defensive unit. I mean, we've barely talked about Jakeem Polk coming back for this team this year. Right. And he's been one of the most electric defenders the past several seasons. So this Atlanta team is stacked defensively. And I think if you're Austin, you've just got to throw your best punch at them. I don't think you can be cute against this hustle defense. They're too freaking good, man. I mean, they're averaging almost 14 blocks a game in their last 5 appearances. It's been against some of the lower teams in the South Division, but at the same time, this Atlanta team gets after it defensively. And I think they have a little bit of something to prove as far as owning up to the Soul being so good at converting breaks. I think Atlanta is going to want to prove themselves in the same capacity against a Soul team that is likely to give them a few opportunities. I mean, to your point, Austin has struggled in efficiency all season long, and this is kind of the opponent that they can't afford to do that against.
Yeah. No, I think there's going to be a lot of interesting in-game lineup adjustments too, because Misha Freistetter is also a name we haven't mentioned. He played majority of his points on D-line last time he was out there. And, they have so many bigs and so many guys that are able to play both ways. And then Austin also, Mick Walter, Josh Stradowski. Oliver Fay. I'm excited for the big matchups, but also like those in-game decisions on like, yeah, do you switch Freystedt around to offense if you need him? What do you do with Jeremy Langdon or Hayden Austin Nab or some of those other guys? So I think both teams kind of have a good amount of flexibility in their lineups. That's going to make it an interesting like in-game coaching chess match at times.
And these are two of the best coaches in the AUDL. You talk about the reigning coach of the year in Stephen Nagy for Austin and Tupa Benson Jaja. I believe he's one of the only head coaches in the league to take multiple teams to the postseason and to a divisional championship game. He did it with Jacksonville a few seasons ago. He's doing it now with Atlanta. He's got the right formula for getting these players up. I mean, it should be his credit and his staff's credit that everyone on this Hustle team seems to have found their role and flourished in it. The past several seasons, Hustle have had talent similar to this level. I feel like this might be the best collection for Atlanta, but they said the same thing before last year's season, and they took New York to the brink of elimination in 2021. So the Hustle have been a very talented team for several seasons, and yet this feels like the realization, right? And I think that almost comes through in the handler play, right? Like we wondered heading into last year what Austin Taylor and Bobby Lay would look like together, and paired with a Christian Olsen, who is the ultimate cleaner fish. I feel like for this offensive unit, he just excels in kind of being a mobile solver on the field for the Atlanta offense. They are playing the best ultimate of their careers combined, and I really feel like they set the table for the successes of Matt Smith basically having a turnoverless season, Brett Halsmeyer playing like an MVP, Dean Ramsey being able to sub onto offense and just immediately become a weapon. That table is set by Olsen, Draco, and Lay. And Lay and Draco are having almost identical seasons. They both have 25 HUD completions at like 76%. I think they have the exact same like HUD completions and attempts. They both have 34 plus assists. They both are up over 3,000 yards throwing. They both have 400 plus completions at a 95% clip. These are two of the best throwers in the league we've known for several seasons, and it feels like they're playing their most efficient passing selves of their careers. And it's awesome to watch, man. It feels like they have it completely dialed in as to when they can shot select on their deep throws and when they want to engage a little bit more drive-oriented offense. I felt like all season long, Atlanta has been one of the best teams at identifying how to attack and win. They really seem to understand the contours of a game and how to express themselves in it. Be really interesting to see how the Soul kind of affect that rhythm, right? Like they did it against Carolina, but Carolina was a team missing many of its kind of stabilizing presences, and that isn't going to be the case with Atlanta. So gets back to our main question, what's going to give? And who's going to be the first new South Division champion, right? I mean, it's been, again, Carolina and Dallas's reign since 2015, Austin and Atlanta now looking for their first championship weekend appearance, but we should move on. We'll move on to the second game of Friday night, the West Division Championship game, LA at Salt Lake. Technically the game of the week. It will air on FS2, but it feels like all four games this weekend are game of the week caliber. After all, it's the championship weekend. Can't get any better except for semifinal Friday, I feel like, as far as just anticipatory matchups. But getting back to the West, LA at Salt Lake, not necessarily the championship game we would have predicted from this division at the beginning of the season or even after the first month of play, right? But the Aviators have taken care of business the last several weeks, and Salt Lake looks like the odds-on favorite to challenge New York this season in the championship game. They have the number one scoring team, the number one most efficient offense. They have a loaded offensive lineup. They have a playmaking D-line, and they have probably 2,000 plus fans getting rabid on Diet Cokes and whatever Utahns consume on Friday nights at Zions Bank Stadium. You know, the last time the Shred played there was against New York. There was just an electric atmosphere. You could feel the Shred feeding off of that. They did it in Week 8 when they beat Colorado for the first time in franchise history. This is a Shred team that has been slowly punching its ticket with quality wins all season. They challenged New York as best they could in that matchup a couple weeks ago. Now they get a chance to really, I think, put an exclamation mark on the season with their first championship weekend appearance. And yet on the other side, it feels like the Aviators are the ultimate foils for this Salt Lake team, whereas Salt Lake is just this well-oiled machine top to bottom. You've got Bryce Merrill just dialing in every correct decision, it feels like, from the sidelines as a coach. All these players just playing together. And then you've got LA, who's gone through at least 3 to 4 different changes so far this season. And yet, because of their stars and Pablo Giannis and Sean McDougal and the rookie sensation Lucas Ambrose, and because of just how much they've bought in visibly to playing with each other these past month or so, it feels like they could be the upstart team to just frustrate and get in the heads of a pretty favorited Shred squad.
It would be pure chaos if LA wins this game. I mean, it's fully possible, but right, just like on paper, you look at the Salt Lake roster and you look at how they've played the entire season. They've just like dominated the West Division in every sense of the word. And they did play a very close game against LA when they had to go to LA, their most recent meeting. I think it was a 20-18 Shred victory. LA, I thought they played really well in the second half of that game, kind of started slower. But yeah, there's some magic going on with this LA team, and they've now pulled out 2 like pretty improbable wins to get to this point. And I'm just excited to see if they can keep things going, if it's going to be like a super clean game by them, or if it's going to be like a little bit sloppy by both teams. I do think the LA defense has kind of been underrated and kind of progressed throughout the season. So maybe they're able to disrupt the flow that the Shred normally have offensively, but it's going to be a fun battle regardless.
I think the evolution of the LA defense the past like season and a half is maybe one of the more underrated storylines in the entire league. I mean, this team was bottom of the barrel, I believe, even last year, getting breaks at a lower rate than like the Mechanix and stuff. I mean, the Aviators struggled to put in breaks as recently as last year, and now all of a sudden they've got this little bit of swagger, right? I mean, it's still kind of got that core feel, the Mitchell Steiners, the Andrew Padulas, the veterans that have been on this team for several years. Yeah. Now they've got all these kind of weapons grade athletes in the Ambroses, the Calvin Browns, Kevin Tien, the Daniel Brunker. I mean, Garrett Santee even, their conditioning coach in the offseason. He plays some of the best just kind of mid-level safety play. He does a lot of reading, picking up handlers on roll bounces. He's been such a nice adjustment piece to them. He can pull. He's one of the best pullers in the league. He's got that amazing backhand that he can also unleash on the counterattack. It just feels like they've sort of cobbled together in places this actually really impressive defensive lineup that frustrated the hell out of Colorado in the opening round. A very good offense, you know. The Summit were missing Jonathan Nethercutt, but as you and I said again and again, this feels like a team that could potentially absorb that level of loss to their rotation. Now they didn't, but they still have a ton of playmakers up there in Colorado, and LA kind of shut them down. I mean, there was that one deep look from Stoughton to Feiner and maybe one other one to Atkins, but it really felt like LA limited Colorado's deep game at home at elevation. And so maybe they can do that again against the Shred. Excuse me, I had a little bit of a brain fart there. But, you know, maybe they can do this on the road for a second straight game. And I think one of the ways in which they do that is that they have really underrated size. I mean, you talk about a Kevin Tien, a Mitchell Steiner, even a Padula. These guys play bigger than they look. Calvin Brown is no small task to deal with in the air. And I really think that has sort of crept up on opponents. I feel like teams have expected in the past to be able to test LA deep and have some success. And honestly, the one I should be mentioning is Lucas Ambrose. You know, he might be the smallest player on their defensive lineup, but
plays huge.
He has a way of high pointing the disc whenever they need him to. I mean, he had a couple of sky blocks on Jordan Kerr in that last matchup against the Shred in week 10. So we'll see that matchup again. It feels like a game for as much as we could talk about the metas of Salt Lake successes and where LA can kind of find marginal play as a team. It might come down to just individual matchups. What does Ambrose do against Jordan Kerr? How does Salt Lake figure out a Pablo Giannis who's been on this tear of late and really seems to be living up to his 6-year contract hype and the redevelopment of this entire LA franchise, right? Like, what are the Shred going to throw in him? Is it going to be a Kyle Weinberg? Is it going to be Chad Jorgensen? Is he going to Chad jail, as Salt Lake likes to put it? It feels like of all the games this weekend, this one might come down most to one-on-one matchups and whose stars are winning here.
Yeah, no, I could see that. I mean, I think DC, New York is always in that conversation as well.
But
we'll get there. We'll get there later.
I'm trying to sell hype here, like obviously.
Well, here, let me give you. I want to acknowledge a few more names on the LA defense that you did not mention. Landon Shank has been very underrated in leading their counterattack. I think, their D-line conversion rate has significantly gotten better, even just throughout this season. And he's been a big part of that. Milan Ravenel had obviously that huge clutch block against Colorado. And then returning to the lineup, currently listed as active, Jason Valley. Did you know he was back for this game?
No.
Yeah.
That is news to me.
We haven't seen him since week 2.
After this on the final versions of these playoff rosters, because of course, this is the week everyone's making micro adjustments as we lead up to the game. So
right.
kind of was pushing the brakes a little bit there. But I mean, I'm glad that you mentioned those 3 players, especially Ravenel and Shank. And it really just speaks to, you can go now 7-8 deep in terms of naming players or contributing to this Aviators D-line. That was not the case that long ago.
Even coming into the season, I could maybe confidently name like 3 LA defenders off the top of my head, and Jason Valley was one of them. But these guys have just all made a name for themselves as the season's gone on. I am curious to see Jason Valley's workload in his first game back. I think was it a broken wrist that kept him out most of the season? So like, I mean, obviously I would hope he can still run as he's been able to, but he was like a huge difference maker for Chicago at championship weekend, in addition to just throughout the season. So like, that is a pretty significant D-line add. But like you said, their depth right now, I mean, it's looking as good as ever.
When they're playing confidently, like they had a sense of owning their matchups against Colorado that frankly I didn't expect. I know that, like, Mitchell Steiner has that mindset. Like, he's had that mindset for almost a decade now in LA. To watch it sort of infuse itself into everywhere, to see Ambrose playing confidently, to see Calvin Brown and Daniel Brunker just getting out those big throws in transition, it just reminds you, like, there are some wrinkles to this LA team that I don't feel like every team out there quite understands as well as the Aviators do. And I feel like they are very much giving themselves that identity of, you don't know our best punch yet. We don't even really know it yet. So we're going to keep developing this. We're going to keep rolling with it. We're going to kind of roll up over some teams. I mean, you could feel against Colorado. It was like, even in that third quarter, when LA was even down a goal or two, it felt like their game, simply how they compose themselves on the field. And I think that that's such a credit to where they're at. They're clearly peaking in the same ways that like an Austin team is, where we had some questions about them even just a few weeks ago. But now all of a sudden it's very clear, this is the best version of LA. This is the best version of Austin, Do you think, so in the LA-Colorado game, the playmaking discrepancy between the two teams, like, it was heavily in favor of LA. Like, LA just looked like they were making all the loud plays throughout the game. Do you think that could be the same this week against Salt Lake, or do you think it's going to be more balanced, or do you think Salt Lake has the edge there? Where do you see like most of the highlights coming from, I guess? I think Salt Lake is one of the toughest teams in the league to say you're going to win the highlight battle against, for how that defense plays, for how Jordan Kerr plays in front of that home crowd, for Grant Lindsey coming on board this year, for Elijah Jaime still feeling like he might have a just gargantuan play left in him this season. Like, I don't know, man. Like, I completely hear you on LA out punching Colorado back a couple Saturdays, but I don't know how that holds up against a Shred team that has defined itself on big plays in its first 2 years of existence. Like, I would like to see it. I would love to see a big fireworks show from both teams out west, and we know that can happen. I mean, last year's West Division Championship game between Salt Lake and Colorado had a slew of big play highlights. So I kind of expect the same in this matchup. And I feel like these two Friday night games are going to be the high-scoring ones of the weekend. I really expect offense to throttle in the East and Central matchups on Saturday night, whereas these games on Friday in the South and the West, I could see both pushing 50 points combined. It just feels like offense is in the air. I mean, Austin and Atlanta are two of the top 4 scoring teams. Salt Lake is the top scoring team, although I will say, Pavlianis mentioned it was in this week's Tuesday Toss or maybe the one prior. They are looking to slow this game down. They are looking to keep this as probably sub 20 goals because they do not want to turn this into a meet with those clear-eyed, full hearts, can't lose shred players, right? Like they've got that Friday Night Lights energy inside them. They will be playing big at Zions Bank Stadium. Let's move on from the Friday schedule into Saturday nights, starting with the Central Division Championship game in Minnesota between the AlleyCats and the Windchill. Windchill have won both of the prior matchups this season with Indy, including a big win at home back in week 11. They have won now 11 of their last 12 games at Seaphone Stadium. They are 1 win away from hosting championship weekend for the first time in this league's history since 2018 when Madison did it. Windchill, of course, going to become the second team to also win a title at home in front of their own crowd. Windchill seem to have a pretty significant advantage in this matchup, particularly when you look at how they played just a few weeks ago against the AlleyCats. However, this is a Minnesota team that has struggled more than any other remaining team offensively throughout 2023. They have 5 straight games with 21 or more turnovers in 6 of their last 7 games. That holds true as well. And this Indy team, for a second straight season, converts breaks at a higher clip than anyone else. They're the most defensively efficient unit in the AUDL. Is there going to be a give point for this Windchill team, or can they take care of business, get their first Central Division crown, and make their first championship weekend appearance in 2023, as it has been as big of a goal as any team in the league this whole season? Windchill really feel like if they make it into that Final Four bracket, anything can happen for them.
Offensively, it feels a little bit similar to the LA-Colorado game from the first round of the playoffs, where Minnesota has just had so many different looks to their O-line this year, from like injuries and varying commitment levels. I think this is the first time we'll see this particular O-line since their first game of the season at Indy, which was an indoor game, and they played great. It was a huge Marco Dregny game out of nowhere to start the season off for Minnesota. But yeah, you just don't really know what you're getting with them. Whereas with Indy, it's like the most consistent offense in the Central Division. It's guys that have been playing together for years and years and years. And you think that the weather is probably going to be the biggest factor in this game, but like, what if it's not windy? That's kind of what I keep going back to. Like, is Minnesota's home field advantage solely based on the weather conditions and the fact that their D-line is just able to suffocate opposing offenses and really take advantage of all those turnovers? Or can their offense afford to be not great and their defense still run away with this game like they have and like they did in that second meeting of the season against Indianapolis? Or if weather is not that big of a deal, is Indy's offense just going to be kind of too clean to give the Minnesota defense that many opportunities?
I think against any other team, Indy has the right kind of strategy as far as establishing the reset swings and everything else. However, that is one of the areas in which Minnesota can put pressure on opponents the best. I mean, you talk about Dylan DeClercq and some of these defenders on the Windchill. They are one of the best units at blowing up reset lanes and poaching into spaces and kind of creating turnovers out of very condensed areas. And I just feel like in the past several matchups, that's kind of gotten the better of Indy. You even look back on that week 2 win that Minnesota had that you were referencing with the big Marco Dregny game. I mean, it was Berglund and Clerk getting a lot of underneath blocks, even indoors. They can generate things out of nowhere. Minnesota has been historically one of the best block producing teams in the AUDL, and outside, especially at that Seafoam Stadium, they just have a je ne sais quoi. There's just something about them when they play there. I mean, DeClercq goes Wolverine on opponents when he starts getting a taste for that
Got
disc.
his goggles.
I think he scored 4 goals in the first quarter the last time these two teams met on defense. Like, they were just running away with the disc on break trains in that game. And I don't know exactly what Indy does to correct that. I know that Indy was missing a few very important playmakers in that game, most notably Cam Brock. He's been, obviously, as the league's all-time leading goal scorer, a hugely stabilizing presence for this Indy offense. But this AlleyCats team continues to evolve around him, right? I mean, you talk about the throwers in Keegan North, Travis Carpenter, and Xavier Payne. They are all seemingly having career years in 2023. Jeremy Keisch and Rick Gross have been terrific hybrid players, particularly in the back half of the season, have really brought up the level, I think, of playmaking on the Indy offensive unit. They're a really balanced team, and yet Minnesota just knows them and matches up with them so well. It feels like there's got to be something extra that the AlleyCats bring, and it doesn't necessarily feel like it comes on offense. I feel like if Indy's going to break through in this game, it has to be defensively, and it has to be taking advantage of that whatever the hell is happening to Windchill's offense. Like you say, they will have a full strength roster for seemingly the first time since their first game of the season. I've been hearing reports from inside of Minnesota that Abe Coffin is playing some of his best ultimate of 2023. Obviously, he got sidetracked by that hip injury, and I believe week 5 or 6 that has really prevented him from playing at his all-star game MVP level that he showed off last November. He figures to be a really big part of a Windchill success story on Saturday. But this Windchill team has so much talent offensively, right? You talk about their goal scorers in Bevon, in Quinn Snyder, in even Paul Krennic, who's played more defense, but they'll sub him over on offense. He's a U24 gold medalist. He can get it done downfield for this team. Will Brandt is playing fantastically as a passer. But there's like a discontinuity, right? It's one of those things that we refer to often where there's sort of the backfield play and the upfield play, and it feels like never the two really meet. They kind of get into sync for a point or 3, and then they fall out of it for like a quarter. And it just feels like Indy's discipline in converting breaks, and with their ability this season, I think, to generate a few more on their own, obviously with the impressive play of rookies, teenagers, and Will Quigley and William Wettengale. They have like an added pressure unit that they can apply to this Minnesota offense. And I feel like if they can do that, they will remain in this game. I don't know that it will happen. I don't know exactly what kind of conditions. Like you were saying, we don't know if it's going to be windy. If it's not windy, I then worry a little bit about Indy's ability to generate pressure against a Windchill team that will have its top passing basically the first time all season. So.
Right. Yeah, no, the chemistry on the Windchill offense is going to be interesting. Maybe it's that they just don't have a lot of like midfield hybrid shooters. Like they're pretty handler driven when it comes to the throwers that they have available. And like we've seen it all season. Like even when Tristan Van de Mortel was playing like O-line QB, like it was just kind of him and then just like everyone around him. But you know, like guys like Bevon can shoot deep. Maybe it's just like there's something that's not quite clicking. And I'm curious to see how they use Abe Coffin too, because with guys available like Clayton and Jason Cheetah and some of their other throwers, Will Brandt, like maybe you can have a little bit more freedom with Abe Coffin, put him in more of a midfield role and have him as kind of like more of a connector piece in this offense. Because it does feel like something that they've been lacking pretty much all season. And it's something that I think LA, we talk about a lot with like the way they started versus how they are now. It's those like midfield hybrids that are just getting more comfortable with the rest of the guys on that line, recognizing opportunities to continue the disc downfield rather than always resending it to the backfield. So curious to see what version of the Minnesota offense we get.
No, I think you make a terrific point. I feel like there is a very visible partition to Minnesota's play this season offensively. I mean, to your point, Bevon is completing passes at a career best, I believe, like 94% this season, but it's because he's taking a few less continuation looks. Obviously, he has the power and acumen to make those throws, but he hasn't always been the most accurate with them. And similar with Quinn Snyder, it's not to say that he doesn't have throws, but it really feels like Minnesota's system encourages that kind of dump reset from a lot of its players and getting them
Right.
the disc in the end zone. You know, Quinn Snyder scored 50 goals last year. Bevon has scored around 30 for several seasons in a row. These are players who like to live in the end zone. And I feel like a player like a Coffin or even a Will Brandt, I feel like can fill into the kind of queen piece role in the offense that can kind of move between the backfield and a little bit more upfield. Obviously, I think Coffin is a prototypical player for that kind of piece. He can just do everything, it seems like, on the Frisbee field. And I feel like that's actually been the role that Xavier Payne, Keegan North, and Rick Gross have adopted so well on Indy. Jeremy Keish, too. They kind of move between a little bit of a backfield facilitator role and going downfield and making bigger plays, using their athleticism. And I feel like that's why Indy has this sense of always being in rhythm. They can kind of work through all three levels of the offense that they need be. You know, actually the biggest player in that role, I think the past several seasons for them has been Levi Jacobs, and he continues to up his completion accuracy and become more of a pivotal and potent player for that offense. And it just, again, they've got now 4 to 5 players who can do that. I mean, Cam Brock at times, as he's developed his throws throughout his career, really has some of those continuation looks and can really facilitate the disc from the backfield into an upfield position without necessarily a hesitation, a reset, a reconfiguration. And yeah, like you say, Minnesota, it's been there at times, but not always. It feels like it's actually more there on their defense. It feels like their defense is continuation looks, the kind of getting a 1, 2, 3 almost chain set play on a deep ball. Like the offense, it feels a little bit more stagnant, but we'll see what happens on Saturday night. That is the Central Division Championship game. Now to the main course. DC, New York, East Division Championship game, the granddaddy of them all. I know I just said that the other week with New York Salt Lake, but we've got 2 granddaddies, I guess, in 2023. Because this is the game, right? Like, this is essentially a mini championship. DC obviously going down to the wire in 2022 in the same matchup against New York, only to be thwarted by a Jack Williams birthday boy Ben Yacht buzzer beater. DC losing the second East Division Championship game in 3 years to New York. This is the premier rivalry in the league. We've gone over it again and again. DC reloaded over the offseason with the express intent of taking down this New York team in the East Division playoff bracket. We are here now. DC seems to be playing their best ultimate. New York, of course, is just a gargantuan competitor, unlike we've ever seen in this league. It feels like they just don't have an out-of-rhythm option. They just only know winning. What superlatives do we even need to say about New York other than 27 straight wins, reigning champs, last 3 MVPs, Ryan Osgard, Jeff Babbitt, Ben Yacht, Jack Williams, on and on and on and on. And yet, this DC team seems to be their greatest challenger, right? Like, they are built not only in terms of personnel, but in terms of coaching and even just motivation, I think, at this point, to challenge New York. It's interesting, right? Like, New York kind of had this tension with Toronto for several seasons when the Rush owned the East Division, and it felt like, what can the Empire do to break through against this team? And it wasn't until Bo Kittredge, Jeff Babbitt, and Ben Yacht all kind of aligned in 2018, and they finally broke through and beat the Rush for the first time ever in New York's franchise history in that East Division title game. And now we're in the era of New York, but it really wasn't that long ago. And so can DC do something similar? Can DC finally get the monkey off their back? Can they make this happen? Can something about Daryl Stanley possibly coaching his last game for the Breeze be an extra motivating spice for this team? I mean, what is this game going to come down to? We've talked extensively about the matchups and kind of the strategies that these teams employ together. It's an adjustment and a readjustment and a readjustment from each of these teams back and forth. They steel sharpen steel, on and on. What's it going to take? Like, what is it going to be for DC to beat New York? Is it going to be finally having a fourth quarter lead to protect? Is it going to be out playmaking down the stretch? I could probably list 1,000 questions as to what might happen.
Sure.
What do you think?
It is funny, like, the weight that the intangibles seem to have on this game, or that we think they could have on this game. Like the fact that it could be Daryl's last game coaching the Breeze, I think that is a huge motivator for the players. And then on the other side, New York, like continuing to prove themselves and never really getting complacent with their rank in the league and like always wanting that next championship. Like that is not going anywhere. And like they would love to just put their foot down and blow out DC, I'm sure. So yeah, it's kind of like my mind just goes to like which team wants it more, which team is going to like really, keep their foot on the gas in that final quarter. But I guess from like a more tangible standpoint, DC is going to have like a 10 or fewer turnover game, which I'm so glad that they've been playing their most efficient ultimate this like the past, 5 or 6 weeks, because it does really make it an interesting matchup as opposed to the last time these two teams met where New York kind of, they didn't win handily by any means, but they kind of controlled the game and it never really felt like DC was going to quite push through to take a late lead or anything like that. But with DC playing their most efficient ultimate of the season, that's the only recipe for success we've seen that can beat New York. It was the 2021 championship game. Carolina had 7 turnovers. That's what it takes, because if it's like even remotely sloppy, New York is going to be the team that dials it in the fourth quarter and overtime, and they're just going to close things out like they've always done. So you really have to get a 2 or 3 goal lead, I would say, going into the fourth quarter to really have a shot at like shutting the door on New York. And the only way to get there is just to play the most efficient ultimate you've ever played before.
As Ryan Osgar said earlier this season, after they beat DC for the second time in the regular season calendar, it feels like this team hasn't played back-to-back bad quarters since he's gotten there. And I would agree with him. I really feel like you have to go back to 2019 at some point. And even that undefeated team, they had more foibles to them. They had some flaws. Since the pandemic, other than that Carolina game and other than DC beating them in the 2021 regular season by a pretty decisive amount when Ryan Osgar was not active in the middle of that 2021 season, there hasn't really been moments of weakness for this Empire team. I mean, even the other loss that they sustained in 2021 was against an Atlanta team that was just playmaking like crazy against the Empire. Like we talked about 2 years ago, that was maybe the most impressive highlight performance against New York as they've been this championship level contender. That's the way in which you beat it, but it doesn't quite feel like DC can do that. It feels like, to your point, it's the execution and getting finally, I think, over the hump of some of their defensive inefficiencies against New York's offense. In that Week 10 matchup, it felt like there were a couple opportunities left on the field for break scores for the Breeze, and they just couldn't quite push it across the goal line. And even last year in the East Division Championship game, it felt that way a little bit down the stretch. I mean, they rallied behind some of those big defensive plays, obviously the Jasper Tom layout block in the reset lane against Osgar, among some many other notable defensive plays. Rowan getting a huge block in the clutch of that game as well. But it's felt like DC's best chance of winning is simply execution in 4-4 quarters. It's just that they're going against the team that is the best at that of anyone to ever play in this league. Like that is the Empire's success, their focus. Like you just talked about it. This team has accomplished everything, and they are not even close to being satiated. Like they don't want just this dynasty this year. They want it next year, the year after that. Like this team isn't slowing down. They want to put themselves a gap and a half between the next best team all time. They want people to look up at them for the next 2 decades as far as what success
they want to they want to be the best team in ultimate history, like not just to this point, but I think of all time, looking into the future too. And I don't put it past them to get there too. I think they clearly have the right mindset, they clearly have the talent and the depth. One thing I do want to ask, I guess in past years when we've compared this DC team to New York, DC I would say is probably the deepest team in the league this year. I would say they are deeper than New York in that their offense runs deeper than New York's. Both teams have extremely deep, 2 full D-lines of talent. But when it comes to like the top end talent, the star power, that's kind of been the main differentiator between these teams, right? And it goes hand in hand with like the fourth quarter overtime clutch plays we see from Jack Williams, Ben Yot, Jeff Babbitt, Ryan Osgar. With all the additions that DC added this year, like, are they at that point still, or are they still not quite there? Like, do they have the star power necessary to like lean on those guys to step up, particularly in those late game situations where we've seen New York do it time and time again?
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely with the emergence of Christian Boxley being an all AUDL player this year, with Ben Ort's addition, he was so good back in week 3 in that overtime matchup that DC ended up losing. Yeah. Ort was matching punch for punch in the second half with New York. New York would make a big play. It felt like Ort would respond. Obviously, Christian Boxley had that incredible sky over John Randolph in the open field, assisted to Ort back in week 3. Those two have been dynamite. I think that also with Cole Jurek playing at some of his best level of ultimate, you talk about Andrew Roy continuing to find a bigger and bigger place in this offense. I think Jock Nissen is playing at a level that he hasn't played at before against New York. He seems to be motivated. Again, it kind of gets back to what we were talking about. There's intangibles here now with DC. There's a motivating factor beyond just like, we need to beat New York. It's now compounded, man. This is multiple seasons built up. They've got real fire beneath them. And you see it too on their defensive play. There's just a different level with how they approach this team. These two teams love to battle each other. There's going to be constant chirping in this game. You saw it at the end of the week 3 game. You saw it at the beginning of the week 10 matchup. It faded a little bit towards the end as New York pulled away, but these teams really, I think, test each other not only in terms of how they compete on the field, but the whole mental side too, right? Like, how is DC going to show up if Jeff Babbitt just continues to own them at the front cone? How is New York going to respond if they slip a little and DC gets a little bit of an advantage and puts themselves in a place that they're not used to? Again, I continue to wonder, when is New York just going to return to the law of averages once and play a truly bad game? Like, they have to crawl out from under. Maybe they still win it, but like so many times in these big games, they're still just playing out of their minds. Like, the only time I can think of that they played poorly in a big or playoff matchup was in 2021 against Atlanta. When the Hustle took that big halftime lead, they got out, 5 or 6 goals. But then the second half, it was New York doing fireworks show highlights on them. It was Ben Yot's 2 biggest plays of his career. It was Jeff Babbitt skying over people. It was the Drosts hitting the Drost button and making plays, as they always seem to do, because they're inevitable as the 2 leagues leader in blocks all time. As soon as I start talking about DC having these intangibles, New York's got the most intangibles of any team in this league, and it's why they continue to be this team at the end of close games. Evan Lepler had some great stats in the Tuesday Toss about New York's ability to close out in the fourth quarter and their performances in overtimes. I think since 2019, they're 6-0 in overtime games. I mean, that's silly. That's silly levels of execution in those kinds of matchups, and yet it's just become the norm for New York. And so, again, it just gets back to DC. What is their job? I think it's just got to be, they've got to throw different things in New York all the time. Like, they just cannot allow New York to see the same look, to get into rhythm against it. But how do you do that? We've talked about it how many times, man? Like, what do you actually do against Osgar and Babbitt and Williams and the rest of that offense? I mean, Solomon Rushmeyer-Bailey, Elliot Chartok, Oliver Chartok, they're playing some of their best ultimate. John Lithgow continues to be exactly who they need him to be as both a big receiver and a facilitator. There just aren't weak links, and they never have off games. And so you, as DC, they've just got to find a way to get, the Alexander Falls shot out of a cannon block, the Luke Rafis, flying, soaring D, AJ Merriman getting a hand block as he did against, was it Ryan Osgar or Ben Yot way back in week 3? They've just got to play make like hell, man. Like, I don't know what else you can do against New York in this situation. I mean, I was going back through film, and I was looking at their final regular season game, New York's against Montreal. Like, Montreal gave them a darn good game, and New York took like a playoff game. Like, they were running real sets. That game meant nothing to them other than what it is to their legacy. And, like, after the game, it's like Jeff Babbitt giving this post-game talk of just total focus and how they need to carry it into the playoff game, no matter who the matchup is, even though they want it to be DC. Like, there's thoughtfulness, there's discipline, there's execution up and down this New York roster. And for DC, they've got to find a way. Like, I don't know if it's, to your point, like playmaking, if it's defensive pressure. I don't know what. It's kitchen sink time, man.
I'm trying to think of like if we ask the question, what would be the way that DC wins? Like, what aspect of the game would it be? Like, D-line conversion rate? Would it be the offense just not turning the disc over? I do think that both D-line offenses versus the opposing O-line defenses is going to be pretty interesting because, Babbitt had 3 blocks in that first game against DC. Like, he is just such a menacing presence when he's out there. Also, Solomon Rushmeyer-Bailey, I feel like we don't talk enough about him as like a really good defender who can make plays. Jack Williams, obviously good at everything. So like that versus, on the other side, like Johnny Mox has some hustle plays here and there. Like, obviously if Rowan is playing offense, like he's going to be playing some tight defense as well. I do think like the D-line conversion rate is always going to be like accentuated in these matchups because you assume generally like pretty polished performances from the two offenses. Although it doesn't always play out like that. Like, I think the last game these teams played against each other, both offenses were converting like between 50 and 60%. So, maybe there are more opportunities than you think, but gotta imagine there's going to be like 8 or fewer break chances for both teams. So like if DC can convert 6 or 7 of those, I think that could be what keeps them in this game.
Yeah. And I mean, maybe it's finally testing out the long ball. I know that New York has some of the best deep defenders in Yacht and Antoine Davis and John Randolph. Like, all those guys are terrific in pursuing disc deep. And yet, for as much as they shy away from it, it feels like DC's just got to try to open it up a bit. And as I say that, I think back, like, DC missed a couple of its break opportunities because they were trying to huck it in transition on their D-line in that New York game at Fosina Field. And it's so hard, right? Like, you have to take risks against New York. They basically proposition it to you. You want to beat us? You're going to have to take some risks, and yet you can't do that. Like,
there's no margin for error is the issue. Right. There's zero margin for error. Yeah, so if you're taking a throw that's like 70 or 80%, like, that's not good enough. It almost has to be like a 90+% risk, if you're taking that deep shot, right? Yeah. And I mean, DC is just going to have to find a way. I feel like I've said that like too many times now. I need to figure a different arrangement of words than find a way. Later.
Find a way. Like, whatever.
Are you taking DC still, by the way? You taking them to win?
I got it, man. I picked them, last October, November? I did it before all the signs. I thought it was finally time. Yeah, I'm going to ride DC.
Cool.
I still like this.
They're due for a win over New York, and New York is due for a bad game. So there's that argument always.
I mean, the other argument is we might still see playoff Jack. It's been another one of those seasons
it's a scary thought.
You look at the stats and you kind of like watch the games, and like, he's been obviously phenomenal. He's Jack freaking Williams. Like, there's no question as to his talent, but like, as far as watching the entirety of New York's season, it hasn't felt like he's been one of the 5 most important players to the regular season so far.
The same as always. Yeah.
The same as always. And yet, last year he set a league record for most postseason assists with 18. The year before, obviously, he had that insane second half against Atlanta, helping spark the comeback, playing like both ways and basically every single point available in that win over the Hustle. He's playoff Jack. And so if that comes out of the woodwork again, like, does DC have an ability to respond? I don't know anymore, man. It's going to be amazing to watch. Like, that's all I care about. I just want another game down to the end of regulation or overtime between DC and New York, which is basically what we're gifted in almost every matchup between these two teams. So, do you have any loose thoughts heading into this weekend? Any kind of angles that we haven't talked about? Any betting lines that you'd love to discuss? I know you're so in betting.
Do you want? Should we? You want to make picks for all the games? I was just thinking, like realistically, who I think is going to win all of them, and it's boring, but I just feel like all the 1 seeds are going to take care of business.
Yeah, I mean, I'm feeling pretty chalky as well, except for, like I say, DC. I'll go chalk except for DC. I'll leave DC.
I like that.
DC train just so I can say I was at the front of the, well, now it's a bus, the front of the bus since the very beginning. So we're going Breeze, baby. Breeze boys all the way. Let's go.
Good stuff.
Well, that'll do it here today on Swing Pass for the preview episode for Divisional Championship Weekend. Again, those games will get started on Friday night on AUDL TV and continue on Saturday night. 2 games apiece on each of the nights. We will be tuning in alongside you. We cannot wait, again, for these final 7 games of the 2023 AUDL calendar as we move past this weekend and towards Championship Weekend. We will be back with you in just a couple days to recap the action and also look out before each of the beginning of the first playoff game in each of the next 2 nights. Daniel and I will be doing some special live pregame shows of Swing Pass, talking about the matchups, doing some little video highlights, maybe doing a little bit of Q&A with y'all. That'll be available on YouTube again, live in about 30 minutes before the first opening pull of both Friday and Saturday nights. There will be information on AUDL social media more about that as we finalize our details. But we figured we'd experiment for something with a weekend as big as this one. Thank you so much for tuning in today. We will talk to you soon. Bye now.